I'm going to share with you 4 concepts. The concepts are imperialism, globalization, socialism, and hybrid war. And the way I'm going to talk about these 4 concepts is through the very dangerous situation currently in the South China Sea, with the United States' immense military capacity, including its most fierce armored carriers, ships, going up and down the South China Sea, provoking China, creating the possibility of a serious clash in the waters around Asia. The United States bringing India, Australia, and Japan into the Quad, QUAD, Quadrilateral Security Arrangement. This Quad has provoked India and China into a clash where soldiers have been killed in the high mountains near Tibet. This is a very serious situation right now for the world. That's why I'm part of a group called No Cold War. And you must visit our website at nocoldwar.org. We have a seminar coming up on the 24th of September, where we're going to talk again with great seriousness about what's happening around China. So using the story of US imposed hybrid war on China, I'm going to explain the categories of globalization, imperialism, socialism, and hybrid war. So this presentation will have 4 sections, and I hope to be finished in half an hour. That's what it is. So I hope that's okay. Here we go. The first thing to explain is the rise of China. How should we understand this? There's a lot of misinformation about the rise of China. Part of the information war conducted by the West has been the suggestion that China is an imperialist. China is being a colonial power in Africa. China's entry into South America is imperialism. It's very interesting, comrades. It's very interesting that it's the United States and the Europeans who are talking about the Chinese as imperialists, when today in Mozambique, in Uganda, the French energy company Total is creating mayhem for the people of northern Mozambique, for the people of Uganda, immense human rights and natural disasters created not by the Chinese, but by the French. What is the French military doing in Mali? What are they doing in Niger? What are they doing across the Sahel? The French don't want to talk about the French in Africa. In order not to talk about the French in Africa, they prefer to talk about the Chinese in Africa. The Belgians who destroyed the Congo will sniff and moan about the Chinese doing this and that. Till now, they have never apologized for what they've done in the Congo. Never. The United States government, which is attempting to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, which has continued to attack the Cuban revolution, which participated with the worst elements in Bolivia to overthrow our brother comrade Evo Morales in Bolivia, the United States, which has had an active imperialist policy, has through its media outlets said China is imperialist. Be careful what you read and what you say. When you listen to what they are saying and then you just repeat what they are saying, your brain has been left behind. You're not thinking independently. You're just becoming a mouthpiece of CNN, which is a mouthpiece of the US State Department. Currently, that means that you are a puppet of Mike Pompeo. Of all horrible people to become a puppet of, that's who you've become if you're not thinking carefully. How do we understand the rise of China? On October 1st, the Chinese will celebrate National Day. On the 1st of October 1949 is the day they honor their revolution, the Chinese Revolution, when the Chinese people rose up, defeated the Japanese aggressors, defeated their own bourgeoisie, defeated the Kuomintang, and so on, and came to power. The first thing to recognize is that all our socialist experiments, from the Bolshevik or October Revolution against the Tsar's empire, 1917, from then till the Cuban Revolution, 1959, till the revolution in Burkina Faso led by Captain Thomas Sankara, 1983, all these revolutions for socialism have taken place in poor parts of the world, in the poorer nations. Not one revolution has taken place inside Europe, not one revolution in Northern America. Germany never had a Bolshevik revolution, however much Marx wanted that. England never had a Bolshevik revolution. It was the poorer countries that broke through, broke what Lenin called the weakest link. That's where the revolutions happened. From 1949 to 1978, for that long period of 29 years, the Chinese communists attempted to create socialism in their country. They made some terrible mistakes because they were struggling to create socialism in a poor country. They made some terrible mistakes, but at the same time, they lifted the standard of life for ordinary Chinese people. Hunger started to go. Illiteracy started to go. Healthcare problems started to go. You see, I was born in India. Indian independence happened in 1947, 2 years before China. If you compare hunger, if you compare literacy, if you compare healthcare in India and China, both countries with a similar population of 1.4 billion people, if you compare these two countries today, they had their independence around the same time. If you compare these two countries, China is miles in another direction than India. India is a country where half the population struggles with hunger. Literacy rates much lower than China. So despite the fact that it was a poor country, in those 29 odd years till 1978, their indicators improved, despite the fact that they were struggling to build socialism amidst poverty. In 1978, the government in China decided it's time to have some reforms because they feared, the leadership in the Communist Party, I think correctly feared, that in technological terms, in scientific terms, China was behind the capitalist bloc. Chinese technology was struggling. And they looked and saw in the Soviet Union, there was a similar struggle. They watched technological improvements take place in the capitalist bloc and said, cannot allow ourselves to be defeated by the capitalists on technology. So they opened their economy. Those are the 1978 reforms. They opened their economy, but with a very clear agenda, not to become capitalists, but to bring technology in. So when you look at the deals Chinese companies struck with foreign companies, they always said, if you want to come and build a factory in Shenzhen, you have to transfer two things. You have to transfer the technology and you have to transfer science. Because they understood a transfer of technology is a short-term gain. When you learn technology, you just learn how to make, say, an iPhone today. You need to learn science because science is a long-term advantage. If you're scientifically able to develop things, you can always develop tech, but science gives you the foundation for technological advances. So the Chinese in 1978 began to draw science and tech into the country, put a lot of effort in this area. This is very key to the advances we've seen in China in the last 20 years. The arrival of science and tech had allowed the Chinese to create quite sophisticated firms owned and run often by the state. Now, let me give you an example. The Chinese welcomed German and French companies that built wind turbines, green energy, big windmills and so on. The companies that had developed these, the most advanced were the French and the Germans. Chinese said, you can manufacture wind turbines inside China, but give us the technology, give us the science. Today, Chinese companies are the world's largest developers, not just producers, by the way. I want to be clear about one thing. China is no longer just a manufacturer of goods that are developed in the West. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. China is an initiator of goods that they produce. In other words, they have developed goods. These are not new wind turbines developed in the West that the Chinese now produce. The Chinese are developing the next generation of wind turbine because in scientific and technological terms, they have leapfrogged over many of the Western companies. So in terms of wind turbine, as an example, the Chinese are ahead of the West. Now, I want to pause for a minute here and come to the second point. So the first point is the road to socialism in the so-called realm of necessity in the poorer parts of the world. The road to socialism is very complicated. You know, countries like Laos and Vietnam, which suffered terrible bombing by the United States, for over a generation. These countries were poor, had been destroyed by war. Cuba, when brothers and sisters took power in 1959 in Cuba, they faced a situation where, the professionals fled the island, capital fled the island, American companies had dominated the entire country. It was a poor country. They had to struggle with great dignity to produce a socialism in their society. It was not a wealthy country that they built, into a socialist country. They had to struggle. So the first point about socialism is socialism isn't a made-to-order idea. You don't just bring it off the shelf. Socialism is a struggle. It is part of the international class struggle. In Venezuela, what is being conducted is an international class struggle to produce a socialist society. It's not a socialist society today. They're struggling on the terms of capitalism to produce a different society. And that's precisely what you see in China. There are, as Frederick Engels said quite carefully, there are zigs and zags. Because we are human beings trying to create a different world. We'll make lots of mistakes. And don't let the capitalist bloc take our mistakes and confuse us. We need to understand that there are zigs and zags in the history of socialism. There will be lots of mistakes. That's because we're human beings. Be careful in how you judge these experiments, because it's not easy to conduct and build socialism in a poor country. That's the first point. Second point, globalization. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, and for many reasons, and I want you to go to the Tricontinental website and read a document we have there called In the Ruins of the Present, because what I'm going to present here is basically a summary of that. In the period after the Soviet Union had collapsed, there were new technological developments, satellites, the ability to move goods through container ships. There was computerization of inventories and so on. So firms were able to break factories up and spread the one factory across the globe. This is a term that we use called disarticulation of production. The translator's name is Facundo. I think Facundo is translating for me. When I was in Rosario, the city of Che Guevara in Argentina, I was talking about the disarticulation of production. Facundo was my translator there. And he remembers the term, so hopefully, Facundo, there is an easy way to translate that phrase, disarticulation of production. All it means is the breaking up of factories, breaking up of one factory into little components around the world. Now, the capitalist bloc understood that if you do that to a factory, you're susceptible to having your intellectual property stolen by other people. Because if you're asking, say, somebody in Malaysia to make printed circuit boards for a computer monitor, then the factory in Malaysia knows how a printed circuit board is made, and they can make another factory and start making it and don't pay you rent anymore. They don't pay you money. They just make printed circuit boards. In order to protect themselves against that, the capitalist bloc changed the law as far as intellectual property rights were concerned. Previously, intellectual property rights were guaranteed based on the process of production. So how you made something was patented. In other words, if I'm making a medicine, the final medicine couldn't be patented in the old days. only the way in which you made the medicine could be patented. This meant that if you made the medicine another way, you could do it. You could freely make the medicine and you could sell it. But after the 1980s, in a process known as the the Uruguay round, it was known as the Uruguay round of the General Agreement of Trade and Tariffs. The meeting was at Punta del Este in Uruguay. In the 1980s, they changed intellectual property rights, the law. And they said, no longer will you have process patents. Now the product will be patented. The final product will be patented. This meant that even if I made something, a medicine, in my own way, I would have to pay rent to the big monopoly company, often based in Europe and so on. So this change of intellectual property meant that for many companies, their intellectual property was the way in which they made money. You might know that Apple computers, some of you are watching this on an Apple computer, Apple computers don't make computers. It's a Taiwanese company based in China called Foxconn that makes most of the components of the computer. Apple merely designs computers, has a brand, and sells computers in the sense that they are a designing company and a brand, and they advertise. They lift up their brand for their computer, but they don't manufacture the computers. That's made by Foxconn. If you own a pair of Nike shoes, for instance, Nike doesn't make any shoes. Nike designs shoes and Nike sells shoes. It's Indonesian subcontractors, Malaysian subcontractors, Vietnamese subcontractors in South America that make the shoes. Nike makes no shoes. So these big monopoly firms, because of the new intellectual property rules, essentially didn't need to manufacture. They outsourced all manufacturing. So this is the idea of globalization. Globalization relies for the massive profit intake by these monopoly firms. Globalization relies on intellectual property rights. In other words, the entirety of Western capitalism has come to rely on its intellectual property superiority. That means its superiority of advanced technology, including not so advanced technology, like how to make a shoe, but generally advanced technology, particularly in computerization, in telecommunications, and so on. This is what they rely on for their economic superiority. It's a very important component of their gross domestic product, the firms of Silicon Valley and so on, like Alphabet, Google, Netflix, and so on. These companies are a large part of US gross domestic product. Last 2 years, the Chinese have both registered more patents in the World Intellectual Property Organization than any other country in the world. They, for the first time, registered more patents than the United States. And in the last 2 years, Chinese scientists have published more scientific articles in refereed scientific journals than academics from any other country in the world, including, of course, the United States. So for the first time, Chinese scientists and technologists are demonstrating a kind of independence and a kind of advance. This is a very serious thing that's been happening from China, and it's not looked at carefully enough. The United States is perfectly aware that if China, particularly in telecommunications, leaps over Western science and technology, Chinese firms, some of them government firms, will have 1 or 2 generations of advantage over the United States. And that is the reason why the United States government has gone so viciously against Huawei and ZTE, because they manufacture 5G. They manufacture, among other things, telecommunications tools. And they are manufacturing telecommunications tools that are light years ahead of what American companies and European companies are making, like Nokia. One of the reasons why American telecommunications companies haven't been able to make advances is when they deregulated telecommunications in the United States, telecommunications monopolies broke up, They began to compete with each other, and they began to cease to develop the next generation of technology. They were not investing enough money in science and tech, whereas the Chinese invested an enormous amount of money in science and tech. That's why the fault line, when you have an earthquake, two tectonic plates run, the fault line of this clash between the United States and China is in telecommunications, because there the Chinese are definitely ahead of the United States. But it's not just telecommunications, it's in robotics, it's in different kinds of new forms of energy, it's in mapping technology, the GPS technology, and so on. Chinese have made new and much more advanced forms of technological developments. Okay, so that's the part about globalization. Globalization weakened the West, ironically, in terms of science and technology, because the Chinese developed their own pathway after 1978 to develop a state interventionist form of advanced development that led to these growth areas for them. Okay, now the hybrid war. Lau, we're okay on time? 10, 12 minutes more? Let's see. The hybrid war. Again, please go to the Tricontinental website, and you'll find in Spanish, in English, in Portuguese, and so on, a dossier we did on the hybrid war against Venezuela. Because it's a dossier written by our office in Buenos Aires and the office in Sao Paulo. It's a really good explanation of what the hybrid war is. And you should really read it, because it'll give you a sense of the hybrid war against Venezuela, which is pretty fierce. But I want to use this concept regarding China. So I'm talking about now two different things. One is, well, first I should define hybrid war. A hybrid war is a full spectrum war, a war by a country against another country, or a group of countries against a country, which is not necessarily a conventional war, a bombing raid, a shooting war, soldiers crossing the border, and so on. The instruments of a hybrid war include economic warfare, financial warfare, diplomatic warfare, information warfare, and so on. There are different kinds of ways of putting pressure on a country. Iran, Venezuela, these countries are experiencing a very severe form of hybrid war led by the United States government, but not just the US and its allies, Canada and so on. Against China, it's very interesting. And I'm going to, again, talk about economic hybrid war, economic aspect of it, and the information aspect of it. Economic. You see, what the United States understands is that 5G, because the Chinese are more advanced, and because they're able to very competently and relatively inexpensively come into countries around the world, including Argentina and whether it's Zambia and other countries, and they can provide the next generation of essentially internet, which can help produce the internet of all things, where you have internet in all kinds of aspects of life. They're very highly sophisticated and fast internet, and they can provide it quite reasonably. No US company can compete at this moment with Huawei, ZTE, and so on. Nobody can. Nokia cannot, which is a Northern European company. They are advanced in telecommunications, but they can't compete with Huawei. Not a chance. So the United States has gone after Huawei in a major way. The chief financial officer of Huawei, the daughter of the founder, was flying from China to Latin America. She was coming to South America to have discussions with governments to talk about Huawei in South America. She was arrested in Vancouver airport by the Canadian government because they accused her of all kinds of nonsense. They are holding her in Canada pending extradition to the United States. But she was on her way to South America because she was coming to South America, coming here to sell Huawei's 5G technology for South America, but they didn't want that. They are using a form of economic warfare, extra economic warfare, lawfare as well, a court case against the chief financial officer of Huawei to prevent Huawei from having basic commercial interactions with other countries. What are they saying? They're saying Huawei has a close relationship with the Chinese government and your privacy is at stake. They will steal your data and give it to the Chinese government. This is, by the way, speculation. Meanwhile, we already have evidence from Edward Snowden, who was in Hong Kong. He was a contractor in the American National Security Agency. In Hong Kong, he met a series of investigative journalists. He handed over US government information. And then he went to Russia, where he talked more about what he had experienced. And he revealed data, documents from the US government about the National Security Agency of the United States, which actually spies using American internet companies like Alphabet, Google, and so on. They actually collect data from these companies. They have operations that they're actually running. It's not a speculation. We have evidence that US companies are actually handing over data to the United States government, to the National Security Agency. So here's the United States coming to you in South America and elsewhere and saying, be careful of Huawei, because this Taiwan-based company might give your information to the Chinese government. But US companies are already giving information to the US government. So somehow we are so gullible and so silly that we believe that, oh my God, let's be afraid of Huawei. It might give our data. Meanwhile, we're perfectly happy right now with our data being given by these companies to the US government. But they've done a very effective information war to convince people to be scared of the Chinese government and not the US government. I'm frankly much more terrified of Donald Trump, Mike Pompeo, Mike Pence, these gangsters, than of anybody else on the planet right now. But somehow they've been able to convince us that China is more dangerous because this company might give. I want you to be very clear about this. No evidence that Huawei is giving the data, but we have evidence that American companies are giving the data. Okay, so they're going in a heavy economic warfare, telling countries you must break with Huawei, because they are afraid to actually compete with them on commercial grounds. Why not have a free market in 5G? They are actually afraid of the free market because they are going to be superseded by many generations. Now they are saying we won't allow chip manufacturers to supply Huawei. The Chinese have put in billions of dollars now to develop Chinese chip manufacturing and soon won't need American companies. Okay, now information war. The coronavirus. I want you to go again to the Tricontinental website. These are all the footnotes. Go to the Tricontinental website. We have a document called China and Corona Shock. I'd like you to read that, because we argue against the information warfare that says that this is a virus which should be known as the China virus. Or, they have some other racist ways of talking about the virus, the Chinese suppressed information and so on. It's all untrue. This was a novel coronavirus. That's why the name is novel coronavirus, a new coronavirus that came in and, has, it has nothing to do with the Chinese, but they're blaming it on China. Also, they're inflaming public opinion around the world, saying, look at what's happening in Xinjiang. Now, I want to pause. I have 2 minutes, so I'm going to use a minute on this. Xinjiang, the United States government, which has destroyed Iraq, which doesn't care about the Palestinians, which is trying to destroy Iran, which murdered Afghanistan, the United States government, which bombed the only pharmaceutical factory in Sudan because Bill Clinton was facing a scandal with Monica Lewinsky. This is the Muslim world, by the way. The United States government, which overthrew a government in Libya, this is the Muslim world, suddenly becomes the champion of Muslims in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs of China. And you believe them. You say, wow, the US government is for human rights of the Uyghurs in China. Seriously, you're seriously going to accept what the US State Department is saying? Look at it for yourselves. Look at what's happening in the, I don't have time to get into this, but all I want to say is this is part of the sustained information war, part of the hybrid war against China. Imperialism, hybrid war, socialism, globalization. These are the kinds of terms I've tried to explain to you in this half an hour using the example of the US imposed hybrid war on China. But you can do something about it. You are militants. You need to be out there campaigning against this war. Go to the website nocoldwar.org. It's very important. There's a statement there against the imposition of this war. We don't need this war right now. We need to spend our entire energy tackling the pandemic, which is a pandemic of the coronavirus, a pandemic of inequality and unemployment, a pandemic of gender violence, and a pandemic of hunger. We are facing real crises in the world. People are actually dying of hunger. Patriarchal violence has increased all across the planet. These are real crises. This US attack on China is a false crisis. It's a crisis not for humanity, but it's a crisis for American capitalism. Don't be drawn into a war on behalf of American capitalism. Take your energies and try to prevent the crisis of hunger. That's where our life, that's where our commitments must rest. Thanks a lot.